We're going to dive into some of the big questions. Are we going to be able to avoid global water catastrophe, a race to the bottom of the well? And if so, how? What are the roles of government, of private sector, of civil society and agencies like FCDO in that struggle? In particular, we're going to be looking at how the ideas of water footprinting and water stewardship can help us deliver a just and sustainable water future. For that learning journey, we need to really start with a good understanding of the problem we're trying to solve. What we're going to be presenting is based on around 25 years of experience working in the sector, our own research, the research of others, and there's a few systematic reviews and evidence reviews that we're going to refer to. We don't pretend to have all the answers by any means, and it'd be great to have enough time to hear your take on the issues and the opportunities ahead of us, so we're going to leave plenty of time for that. In terms of the structure, we're going to recap on the centrality of water security for the UK's global priorities, dive into the nature of the water crisis, and then we're going to quickly explore the response, and in particular, integrated water resource management and its performance to date. Based on that, the opportunities for progress. I thought it'd be useful for you to have this as a reference point. I won't go through all the figures. What I'm trying to emphasise is how water is the enabling factor behind all of the UK's stated global priorities, so that if we're interested in global health, we need to access the basic water services. Water in healthcare facilities, water to control the pandemic is in the middle of that. If we're interested in getting 40 million girls into school, we need to make sure that they're not collecting water rather than being at school, and there are taps and toilets in the schools that they go to. If we're interested in climate and nature, well, obviously managing droughts and floods, providing for hydropower, and preventing the human impacts on water ecosystems where most biodiversity loss is happening at the fastest rates needs to be at the centre. And if we're interested in creating jobs, growth and security, again, water needs to be at the centre. I think there's a real opportunity to talk about, plan for and trigger a blue recovery because of the links between water and economic growth and job creation. We know that around 8% of jobs are water dependent. So there's an opportunity there to look at the productive value of water and to stimulate that in the coming years. If we don't, and if we get it wrong, the World Bank are telling us that GDP growth is going to be hit by as much as 6% by 2050 in some parts of the world. Conflict, I think some of the most startling research I've seen in the past few years is by Flip Wester and the team at Ikimod in Nepal. What they're saying is that even limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees C, that'll mean that about a third of the Himalayas glaciers are lost. And that's going to affect 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity through the flows of water that they rely on in the region. So that's a really startling insight in terms of the links between water, climate change, migration and conflict. So water, without doubt, is a sweet spot or a weak spot if we're interested in global development. Just quickly, the nature of the crisis. So this map is a product of the comprehensive assessment of water management in agriculture, a really important bit of work for us all to be aware of and reference. It's a little bit dated, 2007, but it's the result of an enormous effort by over 50 scientists within CGR and IMI to work out if the world's going to run out of water. This map shows the nature of the crisis. So some important ideas here: physical water scarcity and the idea of basin closure, where those basins, all the water is already being used for various uses, and any additional abstractions will start to impact on the sustainability of those activities and nature. What's important here is that the water scarcity or water scarcity in many parts of the world is driven by economic water scarcity. And that means that it's a lack of capacity, financing, infrastructure to manage water, which is the problem, rather than a lack of water itself. And that's really important. The comprehensive assessment concludes, along with many others, that the true nature of the world water crisis is a crisis of governance, right? This is dead important, that even in those closed basins, management efforts to reallocate water and to make some difficult trade-offs means that there's enough water for everybody for as long as we need, as long as we get better at managing and governing it. So better financing, protection of water, better sharing of it and using it sustainably and equitably. And that's a really important starting point, because rather than chasing after technical fixes, it's the institutional fixes that we need. I'm sure you're all aware of the idea of water security, but again, I think this is a really useful reference point because it combines the ideas of needing adequate water supply, sanitation and hygiene with the ideas of managing water for climate resilience, for conflict mitigation, pollution control, for ecosystems, for production. So it's a pan-water idea that I think is really useful as a starting point. That's the goal that we need our institutions and our governance efforts to aim for. In terms of the institutions that we're interested in, I don't want to patronise those that have worked in the sector all their careers, but it's important for newcomers just to recognise that the water sector is not fragmented, but there are important different elements to it. So irrigation and ag water management, really important because 70% of all the water we use is in the agricultural sector. So in terms of institutions, there's a whole bunch of institutions that are focused on that. Similarly, infrastructure, particularly in places like Africa, there's a real dearth of water infrastructure, and there are institutions concerned, water resource development commissions concerned with enhancing that infrastructure for development, for hydropower, for industry. Of course, there's water for nature and environmental flows. We're familiar with nature-based solutions. You'll have heard that phrase, and we'll get into that. And looking at the watershed functions of river basins. And of course, there's water for health and domestic use, WASH, and water supply, sanitation and hygiene. Now, the most important institutions from our perspective are concerned with water resource management. This is because they're in the wheelhouse of water security, which really determines whether these other institutions can operate sustainably and whether there's enough water of good enough quality for them to meet the needs of their stakeholders. So water resource management determines who gets what water when and the quality that it's at. And that's why we think it's deserving of special focus. Just really simply, water resource management, integrated water resource management, in effect, is the management of water in ways which protects and preserves downstream water uses, values and functions. So effectively, if you're planning to take water out of the environment or put wastewater back into the environment, there's an agency, an authority that determines how and when that can happen and sets standards so that downstream ecosystems, downstream water users are protected. Similarly, for land use change that might affect the hydrology, there's a government-mandated authority acting usually at a basin scale to control that the public interest is protected. Now, it's important to recognise this idea of a hierarchy because in most countries, basic human needs are the top priority and protected above environmental needs, above commercial water use, etc. So there's a ranking of values and uses that water resource management aims to protect. Now, it's just important to reflect on the key functions of a basin authority that tries to deliver water resource management. It's there to monitor and understand the water available and future demand, to plan allocation, to control use through permitting, pollution control, so that if you want to discharge water, there's standards around what you can do. Really importantly, development control. So if you want to develop land or do stuff in a catchment, the Basin Authority will advise on how that takes place so that you can protect important water functions. They also are responsible for compliance and enforcement of the rules around water use. They manage droughts and floods, they resolve conflict, and importantly, they collect fees and charges from water users to help sustain and finance that system. And across IWRM, or water resource management, the idea of participation by stakeholders is important and emphasised in, for example, stakeholder participation in basin councils, which are supposed to oversee how this all works. Water resource management, IWRM, is really how it works. It's the only game in town for managing water resources. It's how we do it in the UK. It's exactly how the Environment Agency works. In terms of global uptake, since the 1990s, there's been a worldwide adoption of IWRM, right? And this map shows that. I think the gaps are just they didn't participate in the survey rather than not adopt IWRM. And it's been supported by the donors. There's been a massive effort to reform laws and regulations to reflect the idea of integrated water resource management. There's policy, and a lot of it is progressive and ranks those uses and prioritises environment and human use over commercial use. And there's been significant donor backing, including by the UK, the Global Water Partnership. Their entire modus operandi or aim is to implement IWRM, the World Bank, EU, GIZ and others. Despite that, the UN tell us that by 2030, less than 40% of countries are going to be on track for actual implementation. So the story is that policy and laws in place, but it's not implemented or implemented badly. A lot of the work that we do at Water Witness looks at that, tries to understand it, to highlight it, and to work out what to do about it. A lot of slides here to show this, but the result is anarchy. I don't think that's an overstatement. We see water grabs, illegal water use, chronic and acute pollution affecting many people, aquifer depletion, degradation, drying of rivers, unmitigated droughts and floods, and intense subnational water conflict. So people shooting each other over boreholes. A few examples. The work we're doing in Ethiopia right now shows this, right? So you've got the industrial parks that are the mainstay of Ethiopia's economic development plans. I mean, huge industrial parks, 70 hectares ago, employing sort of 40, 50,000 people each, 9 of these across Ethiopia. None of them have been situated or planned where there is good water available that's not already being used because of a lack of water resource management. And that threatens to derail a big part of Ethiopia's economic development plans. Lots of other examples. Zambia, Lusaka's water's running dry. Dar es Salaam, Peru. You don't have to look far to find really good examples of anarchic water resource management. That's particularly destructive for countries that have what's called bad hydrology, so where their economic prospects are highly dependent on harnessing water for agricultural development, for rapidly growing cities. So many of the countries that need water resource management most are least well prepared through capable institutions to deliver the challenge. Within those places, it's undoubtedly the poor and the marginalised that feel the impacts most acutely and most immediately. If you've got money, you can buy your way out of water problems. So it's a problem of equity and it's a problem of inclusion. So what's happening or what's not happening? So we've got really good law, policy in place, but it's not being implemented. The crux of this is to understand why that is. We need a clear diagnosis to guide global efforts to fix water resource management. Now, there's a whole industry that's grown up around critiquing IWRM, and some of it is a bit oversimplistic, and that's part of the problem, right? So where we say there's a lack of data, a lack of coordination, a capacity, or there's because of corruption, that can lead to fixes that actually add to the problem. The circus of capacity building workshops that drag frontline water resource managers away from the field to collect per diems for attending a training course that they've attended 10 times over. It might meet a log frame target, but it's not helping deal with the problem. Actually, evidence about where the problem lies is limited, and we know this because DFID commissioned Water Witness and the University of East Anglia to undertake a systematic map back in 2014. Of about 30,000 papers that talked about good governance for poverty reduction and sustainable development, 30,000 papers talked about it. Only about 40 papers actually had good evidence. You can imagine the frustration in searching through them all. What they tell us, and what we know from research since and from our own experience, is that implementation of water resource management, IWRM, and good governance lacks adequate human and financial resource. There's no doubt that there is a capacity problem. Our analysis suggests that most countries in Africa are spending about 10% of what's actually needed to be water secure. And we've developed some methodologies around that. And of course, that means that there isn't the human resource to manage water or the financial resource. There's also a problem with brain drain, right? So water resource management is a complex task, a limited set of professionals that can do it. Working for the World Bank, WaterAid, Water Witness, FCDO pays a lot better than working for a government-based authority. So there's a problem with human resources in the sector. There's a problem with accountability, oversight, and incentives. One of the problems is that there are often multiple agencies with joint accountability for parts of water resource management, partially because of donor-led development, right? So you've got water basin authorities alongside, in some places, pollution control authorities. In some places, you've also got environment agencies trying to do the same job. So the lines of accountability and overlapping mandates make things really blurred and make for ineffective compliance and enforcement. Above all, there's a real lack of political prioritisation of water governance and water resource management. These agencies lack power and authority and the clout that they need to rein in much more powerful ministries and private sector actors. This is a little cartoon which tries to capture that from our colleagues in Tanzania. You've got lots of water users there, a multi-headed donkey, that are taking all the water and making a mess of the water. There's no incentive. There's neither really a carrot nor an effective stick to control their use of the resource. And you can see there's confusion amongst the regulators about who implements the law. And why is there no change with that, given that water security is so important? Well, we think that we see that some powerful elites benefit from this status quo. If you're rich enough, you can buy your way out of the problem, which means there's little momentum for change. Now, a slight aside. Of course, the conclusion is, what's wrong with IDRM? It's the political economy, stupid. Okay? It's about power, it's about incentives, it's about authority. I want to flag some really brilliant work by this guy, Arturo Israel, World Bank economist. After a whole career of trying to build institutions around the world, he did a study that tried to work out why some institutions performed well and others floundered. A really brilliant tome that he's written. Someone from DFID a couple of years ago said it's the most important contribution to capacity building theory or institutional development theory of the past 50 years. I agree, right? But what he says is that the efficacy of institutions and the inbuilt incentives for performance are strongly related to the task that they're trying to undertake. So if you get it wrong, and if the feedback is immediate, intense, and attributable, then the incentives are much stronger. So things like building an airport, running an airport, building a nuclear power station, the incentives for good performance are there. For other types of task, like water management or managing climate change, the inbuilt incentives are weaker. And you need to think of different ways to build institutional incentives. Let's think about water, right? If you get it wrong, if you start overdrawing an aquifer or polluting an aquifer, it can take many years to show. Have multiple culprits, and you can literally blame it on the weather. So institutional performance for water resource management or water governance more broadly will benefit from strong independent oversight, performance tracking, and public visibility. And that's why we do our work at Water Witness, right? That's exactly why we exist. If we're interested in progress on the water crisis, and we need to be, at the centre is strong institutional performance for shared water security, with the resources, with the political authority that it needs to negotiate those difficult trade-offs, to make those difficult decisions. What we can do is provide intelligent technical assistance and system strengthening. There's no doubt that there are opportunities to share approaches around the world, to give mentoring support, to give the confidence to water managers that's needed to deliver on that task. That needs to be done in really intelligent ways, not through consultants, not through fancy strategies that sit on shelves, by giving success opportunities to those water resource managers, learning by doing. And there's a lot of emerging insights on that. Probably some of the best technical assistance we've seen is long-term practitioner-to-practitioner support, which builds a relationship rather than parachutes in and out as a consultant-led effort. Underpinning that, we need progressive financing. We need to close that financing gap. Desperately important, right? So there's a dearth of financing. When we talk about progressive financing, there's several things of meaning here. So looking at how water is priced, paid for, and valued. In California, in Ethiopia, you don't pay volumetrically for water, which is insane. There's no incentive to use less water, and there's no mechanism for generating revenue for water management from that. And so reforms to the way that water is charged for, whilst protecting people who can't afford it, the poor, can have a really important role in improving the incentives for better water use and prudent water use, but also generating revenue for the government and institutions responsible for the task. And we've seen some brilliant progress on that in Tanzania that I hope catches online to talk about. We're also interested in how climate finance can help close the gap. We're also interested in how the global markets and investment community can help lever finance and investment into the challenge. We've referenced accountability, monitoring and oversight, and we think there's a huge opportunity here. This is a quick model which shows what we're talking about. So the role of civil society and citizens in monitoring and shouting out about water injustice, poor institutional performance, and bargaining for change and responsive governance at all levels, right from local authority, community level, right up to global commitments and global policy. This is a slide from our work in Zambia, funded previously funded by DFID, our Fair Water Futures programme. So we've been trying these approaches for the past 8 years. Not always easy, but this tells the story, right? These people here with the T-shirts who look a bit annoyed are from Chongwei, a community of about 60,000 people whose drinking water supply starts here, which is the outflow from Lusaka's wastewater treatment plant. And this chap is the manager of the plant. And you can see the outflow hasn't treated the industrial and human sewage, which contaminates these people's water supply. So by joining the dots between rights holders and duty bearers, we're trying to incentivize better performance. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Accountability interventions are quite broad, right? So they can range from what we just talked about, citizen engagement, broader research and advocacy by civil society. Budget tracking plays a really important role. So is there enough money being spent? Is it being spent on the right things? Is there leakage and corruption? But also government-led accountability mechanisms. So, grievance mechanisms, incident tracking, parliamentary scrutiny, ombudsman, auditor general reports. So there's a ladder of accountability interventions. In our global evidence review, which the links are linked to here, we reviewed the global evidence of how these interventions perform. And excitingly, we found that in 80% of accounts, positive outcomes are reported for water governance and wash services. Also very usefully, the review identifies what makes those interventions work. What is it about those interventions which make them effective? That's gold dust for hopefully people like you who are interested in progress and learning about how the approach of donors can stimulate or constrain how these interventions work. They're not easy, because they're about politics, right? They're about legitimacy and holding governments to account. So they're tricky things to support and manage. But with our partners in the Accountability for Water programme, and there's a whole raft of them, we're trying to fill the knowledge gaps around how accountability can contribute to addressing the challenge, to scaling impact, and importantly, to establish a global support facility to allow civil society to do that important work. We think there's a lot to be learned from that work for the climate agenda. Yeah, so looking at how civil society accountability tracking, budget tracking can deliver efficacy of climate finance and resilience. So I'm not a big fan of burgers, but I thought this would be useful to help you remember what I've been talking about. Institutions, intelligent technical assistance, progressive financing, accountability. The question is whether water footprint, stewardship and corporate engagement is the special sauce that can help make that a very tasty and satisfying and successful burger. Over the past 10 years, we've seen a massive uptick in the interest of global corporations on water management and water governance, stemming from water footprint analysis, stemming from the financial Armageddon that faced Coke in India, from the work of CDP, for AWS and others. There's a huge increase in interest by the private sector and corporations on water and dealing with water risk that affects them. So reputational, operational, financial. The question is whether that new interest can support stronger institutions and deliver water security for all by helping shape the political economy of water governance, right? So powerful actors that pay a lot of tax, that have amazing communications and political reach, involving them in this struggle for better institutional performance, is that going to help us all, or is it going to lead to water securitization for those companies? And that's a really exciting area to be diving into, and that's what we're going to be looking at next time. So just to recap, shared water security is central to attaining the UK's global priorities, no doubt. Crisis is a crisis of poor governance above anything else. Climate change and population growth, cities, that's an important backdrop, really important backdrop, but it's about governance in those contexts. IWRM, water is really the only game in town, and water trading, etc. is the wheelhouse of water security. Policy and law are on paper, but implementation is weak. And it's the political economy drivers and incentives which can explain that. So the opportunities for progress are about elevating the political importance of water management, intelligent technical assistance, progressive financing and reform, and accountability and oversight to provide those incentives. And we'll look next time at how fair water footprints can help shape that. To be continued.